Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. 2023 was an amazing year for handheld gaming. There were so many different releases, both the very cheapest all the way to the highest of the high end. In this video, we're going to talk about my very favorites that were released this year. Now, there are so many different handhelds on the market right now, it can be pretty confusing to jump in, and so in this video, I want to narrow it down by different price points and form factors. So I'm hoping that by the end, based on your budget and the games that you want to play, you'll know exactly which one is going to be the perfect match for you. So I think we're going to have a lot of fun in this video. Grab a snack and drink, and let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's get started with the very budget category. Now, this is where I'm looking for the very cheapest handheld you can get that's still going to be worth it. Now, if you go on Amazon or AliExpress, you can often see these handhelds that are like $20, $25. They promise to be able to play thousands of games. They often seem like they're too good to be true, and I'm here to say that they usually are. Now, generally, there's something wrong with those cheaper handhelds. Either the games list is terrible, the software is all messed up, they have a bad screen, or the controls are not very good. So it's very rare that you actually find one that meets all of those parameters and still is a very good option. And the only one that I recommend in this budget category is this one here. It's called the R36S. Now, I've been testing this one for about a month at this point, and I did a review about it last week, and I was really impressed. This thing will retail around $40, but often you can find it cheaper, but also bear in mind that because it's growing in popularity, there are some companies that are starting to mark it up. So I would recommend here, try to find it within that $40 price point. Once it gets into $50 and $60, we're in a whole different tier, and that's what we'll talk about in the next section. Anyway, what I really like about the R36S is that it has a pretty powerful chipset in the fact that you can play all the way up through PS1, absolutely no problem, but you can also still play a smattering of Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, Sega Saturn, Nintendo DS, and even a little bit of PSP as well. So there are quite a few different systems that can play on this budget handheld, and given the fact that you can often pick it up for about $40 if you shop around, I think it is well worth it. Now, a couple other things I really like about the R36S are the controls are pretty decent. They're not the best, but there are ways to mod it if you would like. And then also the screen is very good. It's a 480p resolution, 4:3 aspect ratio. It's a perfect fit for retro gaming. So if you are looking to play just a good amount of retro games, this one's a really great option. The other final nail in the coffin of why this one I think is the best budget option around is the chipset. It's the RK3326, which again is a decent chipset, but the thing about it is that it's been around for years. And so as a result, you have custom firmware options that can improve your software experience because they've been developed for other devices using that same chip. So this one kind of stands on the shoulders of all those other ones, but then undercuts them by being about half the price. And so I think that if you can find this one for $40, it's a no-brainer. Now, as far as being your own primary handheld, there are definitely better options out there, which we'll talk about here in a moment, but I think this one at $40 makes a really good gift idea. So if you're looking at getting it for somebody else, a family member who doesn't want to set all this stuff up themselves, I think that is a really good option there. Anyway, if you're interested in learning more, I'll leave a link to my video review down below, as well as a link to buy it if you are interested. And I'll do that for all the other handhelds going forward in this video. Okay, we're going to move up a little bit in the budget category to the $60 section. Now, this is probably my favorite category to talk about because there are so many different options, and I think $60 is the perfect price point for an entry-level handheld. If you think about it, a full Nintendo Switch game, brand new, costs about $60. But here you can get a handheld that's going to be a full system, and it can play thousands of games. So I think it's a really great deal at that price point. Now, there are many options within this category, but I think there's one very clear winner, and that is the Miyoo Mini Plus. Now, this is a vertically oriented handheld that's a little bit on the small side. It's very similar to the one we were just looking at, but it's a lot more pocketable. And this one is actually a larger version of the original Miyoo Mini, which came out last year and took the handheld world by storm. Unfortunately, that one has been basically discontinued because it's been really hard to find parts to manufacture more. But the thing is, I think the Miyoo Mini Plus is a great consolation prize. It is a little bit larger, but has a larger screen, and the controls are a lot more ergonomic because you have more space for your hands. And in addition, it has internal Wi-Fi, which means that you'll be able to connect this to the internet, do things like playing against your friends in multiplayer, but then also you can use retro achievements, and you can do online updates as well for the software. There's a few things that stand out for me. Number one is the controls. The D-pad and the face buttons are just a joy to use. They have a little bit of that clicky and mushy kind of texture from old retro gamepads, but it's just been tweaked to perfection, and so I really enjoy playing this handheld. In addition, the Onion operating system that I recommend for this handheld really elevates the experience. You'll be able to navigate through and find all of your games, but you can also download box art to make it look very pretty. And the whole experience is very very intuitive and perfect for newcomers. And the price point on this is excellent as well. It's going to be between $55 and $65 depending on where you pick it up. If you want to save the most money, then grab it from AliExpress. You can buy it directly from Miu. It's going to take a little bit longer to get there, but it'll have free shipping and it'll be about 55 bucks. Or if you want to have a bit more convenient of an experience, you can grab it on Amazon for about 65 bucks. You'll have it in a couple days and easy returns if you don't like it. Now, in terms of performance, the Miu Mini Plus can play up through the 16-bit and also PlayStation 1 era with relatively little issue. In addition, we've got a couple new game systems that are working for it, including Nintendo DS and Pico 8. Either way, when it comes to that $60 category, yes, I recommend the Miu Mini Plus, except for the one that we're going to show off in the next category. So let's jump into that. So next we're going to talk about micro handhelds. There are quite a few options here, and this is a very niche use case. So for example, you want something very small to just throw in your pocket, maybe in your purse, something that you'll have around but doesn't take up a lot of space. There's a big group of people who really want to have that experience where, you can be sitting in line at Walmart or whatever, and you can just pull it out and start playing for a few minutes here and there. And that's where those micro handhelds really come to shine. Now, when it comes to micro handhelds, there weren't a lot of releases this year. The only major one was this, the Anbernic RG Nano. Now, this thing is super tiny and charming, but all the same, when you actually try to play it, it's not that great of an experience. The controls are pretty cramped, and the screen is very small. Instead, my favorite micro handheld of this year actually came out last year. So let me explain. This is called the TrimUI Smart. It came out late last year, and I did a review about it, and I said it had a lot of potential, but I thought that it needed some updates when it came to the software. Well, lo and behold, a few months back, there was a big update for it with a custom firmware called MiniUI. And essentially, this is a bare bones software that'll allow you to just get in and out of your games with no frills. Now, what I love about it is that it has a sleep function and an autosave function. So what you can do is you can put it to sleep, turn it off, turn it back on, and it'll go right back to where you were within the game. So it's a really plug and play experience. Given the fact that the TrimUI hardware itself is very good as well, the controls feel good, the screen is a little bit small, but of course it's a micro handheld, it's just a really nice and pocketable handheld. And so I've been playing this almost as much as all the other handhelds that we have in this video here. Now, in terms of performance, the TrimUI Smart can play up through PlayStation 1, but with a little bit of trouble. It's not going to be quite as powerful as the Miu Mini Plus, but for the most part, most Super Nintendo up through PlayStation 1 will work okay. Now, the price point on this one is also around $60 depending on where you shop, and so that's why I'm bringing it up, because between this one and the Miu Mini Plus, they're very similar in price, although I do think the Miu Mini Plus is overall a better handheld. However, if you want something very small and pocketable, then I think that the TrimUI Smart with the MinUI operating system is a really great combo as well. Alright, so that's it when it comes to the budget section. Let's move on and talk about what I'm now calling the under $100 category. Now, there are a lot of options here. In fact, it was very hard to narrow it down. Even when I picked my one winner, I still had a couple runners up, so let's talk about those two first. Let's start with the Powkiddy X55. Now, this one is $90 with free shipping, and I think it's really impressive. In fact, when it first came out, I was calling this the best handheld under $100 right now. And I think a lot of that still holds true because a lot of these elements are very good. In addition to having some nice ergonomics and controls, we have a nice big 720p resolution screen. Additionally, the chipset on this one is upgraded. It's the Rockchip RK3566. This one will be able to play up through PS1 no problem, but then also will play a good amount of Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, Sega Saturn, and PlayStation Portable. Now, not all the games from those systems are going to work perfectly, but if you have specific like lightweight or 2D games you want to play with this system, it's probably going to work fine. Now, once we get into this category, you're going to see a lot more quality of life improvements. For example, the X55 has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and also HDMI out, which means that you can plug it into an external monitor and then hook up a Bluetooth controller, and all of a sudden you've consoleized your little gaming handheld. So I think that's pretty awesome. So in particular, if you're looking for something under $100 with a pretty big screen, then I think the Powkiddy X55 is still a really great choice. Now, the next option at the under $100 price point that I think is a great runner-up is going to be this one. This is the Anbernic RG Arc. Now, this one has a 4-inch screen, so it's still pretty big, but a 4:3 aspect ratio. However, the largest draw here is going to be the Sega-style controls. Not only is the D-pad very similar to those old-style controllers, but we have a 6-button configuration here on the front. And this kind of setup is a rarity when it comes to retro handhelds. Often you'll only get a 4-button configuration. And so there are specific use cases where this Anbernic dynamic RG arc really shines. And of course, right off the bat are going to be older Sega titles. So Sega Genesis, Sega CD, 32X, those are all going to run beautifully on this handheld. In addition, this has the same chipset and performance as the Powkiddy X55 we were just looking at. So that means you will be able to play a good amount of Sega Saturn and Dreamcast games as well. In addition, with this 6-button layout, you'll be able to play a good amount of arcade fighting games. If you think about any of those Capcom style games, they are all excellent on this controller. So when it comes down to it, if you grew up in that Sega era and you want something with a really nice D-pad and that 6-button layout, then I think the RG Arc is definitely worth considering. This one will cost you around $80 for the cheaper end, but they do have a more expensive model as well that can dual boot into Android. And we're actually going to discuss this handheld a little bit more later in the video when we talk about the potential of some of these devices in 2024. Okay, so those are my two runners-up when it comes to the sub $100 price point. Now let's talk about the real winner here, which is going to be the Powkiddy RGB30. And I gotta be honest, when I first heard about this device, I had some misgivings. The company that made it, which is Powkiddy, has a habit of making a good device and then a couple really bad ones. And because they had already made the X55, I wasn't expecting them to be a two-hit wonder. But it turns out that the RGB30 is one of my favorite handhelds of the year, and there are many reasons for it. Number one is going to be the screen. This is a 720p resolution, which means that you have a lot of scaling options when it comes to retro systems. In addition, it has a square aspect ratio, 1:1. And while you may not think that's a good fit for playing retro games, it turns out it's actually pretty brilliant. Not only will your standard 4:3 systems look very good on this screen, but also those with a squarish aspect ratio, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Pico 8, Neo Geo Pocket Color, those will all look brilliant. In addition, you can play around with some of the scaling options to get systems like Nintendo, Super Nintendo, and Sega Genesis to look amazing as well. So by a long shot, my favorite thing about the RGB30 is the screen, but there are still some other elements that are very good. Number one, it has the same chipset as the other handhelds we were talking about in this category, so performance here is going to be pretty great. In addition, because it's a square screen, the device is a little bit tall but also compact horizontally. That means it's going to be a very ergonomic and kind of blocky feeling, and it actually is really great to hold in the hand. And so I think this one is a great mixture of nostalgia when it comes to kind of a chunky feeling, but then also some of those modern comforts like a high resolution screen. Either way, if you want to learn more about the RGB30, I've made a few videos about it, including a full setup guide. So if you want to get started with this device after picking it up, that's what I would recommend. Okay, as we move into the over $100 category, there is a device that I do want to mention. This one actually has an MSRP starting at $99, but that doesn't include shipping and taxes. So really this one is about $120, $130 at the end of the day. However, this little device is so good that I decided to give it its own price category. And so this here is the Retroid Pocket 2S. And there's a few reasons why I like this one so much. Number one is going to be the price to performance. At this price point, the amount of games that you can play on this is pretty incredible. Like with the other systems, it can also play Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast and Sega Saturn, as well as PSP. But what separates it from the others is that those systems will actually run really well. In fact, just about the entire catalog is going to be fully playable when it comes to Dreamcast and Nintendo 64. So if those are some of your favorite systems, then this is going to be the cheapest handheld you can find that's going to be able to play those really well. Another thing I like about this one is that it's a very good starter handheld. This one is actually Android based, so if you've ever set up a phone or a tablet before on Android, you're going to be right at home here. And because it's an Android system, you'll have access to some emulators you won't find on those others. So for example, this plays a good amount of Nintendo 3DS games, and you can play a fair amount of GameCube and PS2 as well. Not a ton, and you have to do some settings tweaks to get them to work, but all the same, I would say maybe 25% or a third of the games are going to be playable. So the way I see it, if you have a budget of around $125, it's a no-brainer. I think the Retroid Pocket 2S is going to be your best bet. However, if you want to push the price up just a little bit more, you can find some really good options. And that's going to be our next category. It's going to be between $150 and $175. And here again, we've got a lot of choices, but I had to narrow it down to just one. Before we get to that one, let's talk about our two runners-up. So the first one we're going to look at is this, the Retroid Pocket Flip. Now this one is the same company that the device we were just talking about, but it has a couple distinguishing factors. Number one, it has a much better chipset. This one is the T618. Remember that number because we're going to be talking about it for the next couple handhelds. Now this one is very similar to the one we were just talking about, but the performance is even better. Not only can it play all the systems we were talking about before, but they can play them upscaled, and that's because this one has a higher resolution screen. And so as a result, you can play certain systems like Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and PSP, but at a 3x or 720p resolution. So those games are going to look super sharp and crisp. In addition, because we have more performance, you can also play more PS2 and GameCube games, not all of them, but about 50%, and it can also play a little bit of Nintendo Switch as well. Only really lightweight games, but still, that's pretty incredible. Now, of course, the other thing that separates the Retroid Pocket Flip from the others is the form factor. This one is a clamshell handheld. So it's very similar to like a Nintendo 3DS, but without that second screen. Now, in addition to the clamshell form factor, which is kind of a rarity these days, it also has some pretty neat features. For example, instead of just regular old analog sticks, this one has 3D analog sliders, and these actually use Hall effect sensors, which makes them very accurate. Now, whether or not you like sliders is a matter of opinion, but I personally like them, except for when I'm playing first-person shooter games. And then finally, the thing that really separates this one is that it feels like its own unique console. Many of these other handhelds that are Android-based start to feel like they're a phone with controls attached to it. This one does not because it's a clamshell, and so as a result, it feels like its own true unique gaming console. And so in particular, if you are really drawn to that clamshell form factor, then I think the Retroid Pocket Flip is a no-brainer. Up next, we'll talk about our next runner-up. This one is going to be the Anbernic RG405M. Now, this one also uses that same chipset we were just talking about, the T618, so the performance is going to be the same here. You can play all the way up through GameCube and PS2 with some relative good performance. Now, the thing I love about this one is that it has a 4-inch screen that is a native 4:3 aspect ratio. That means it's going to play a lot of those games at the native resolution, and it's going to look very good. And finally, the other thing I really like about it is how small and compact and pocketable it is. This is one of those handhelds where I feel like I can just grab it and take it around wherever. In addition, it has an aluminum shell. I'm kind of torn about this one. It feels very premium, but I wish it was plastic and a little bit lighter. In fact, I'm still kind of holding my breath and hoping that Anbernic releases one called the RG405P, which will be a plastic version of this one. Now, the only downside to the RG405M is the resolution. It is 480p. Now, that's native to a lot of systems like Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, but all the same, this chipset is capable of going at a higher resolution. And for that reason, there is one handheld that edges it out a little bit more, in my opinion, and that's going to be the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. Now, this is kind of a cheat because this one came out late last year, so it's officially a 2022 release, but all the same, it's one of the devices I've been playing the most in 2023. In fact, anytime I went on a long trip, this was one of the main devices I always brought with me. It's also Android-based and has a really great long battery life, and it has all the same performance of the other devices we were just talking about. In fact, it's almost identical to the Retroid Pocket Flip, but in a more Nintendo Switch Lite style form factor. And so for me, the Retroid Pocket 3 is just a mixture of all my favorite components from around this price point. Not only will we have that great performance, but the ergonomics and controls are excellent, and we've got a nice big display which is capable of playing these games at a high resolution of about 720p. And to be honest, within this price category, any of these three options are excellent, so if any of them appeal to you, I think it's still going to be a great buy. Okay, so that's it when it comes to the under $200 price point. Now we're going to move on to the next category, and there's actually a pretty big jump right here. And that's because between the $200 and $300 price point, there are not a lot of options that came out in 2023. Instead, I think it's worth taking our time to go into the $300 category and really talk about this one, because I think that the jump here really does justify that additional cost. And the handheld that we're talking about here is called the AYN Odin 2. Now, this has only been out for about a month at this point, but it has really revolutionized the handheld gaming industry. And what makes the Odin 2 so amazing is that it has a really high-end chip in it. A lot of these other devices use like very cheap or low-end cell phone parts, but this one is not like that. In fact, this has a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 chip inside. And that's a very powerful processor. In fact, many flagship phones that came out over the past year were using this chipset, and so that says a lot about a retro handheld that can play it as well. And the amazing thing here is the starting price. It's $299 for the base model, but there are higher end models that I actually recommend considering because it'll give you more RAM and it'll make certain systems play better. And that's an amazing price point for this chip. In fact, you can't find a phone today at that price point with the same chip. And in addition, this one's a full-on gaming console, which is kind of amazing. Now, in terms of performance with this chipset, it's really funny because the only limitations we have here have nothing to do with the chip, but rather the Android ecosystem. So yes, this can play all the way up to Nintendo Switch, and your only main limitations here are going to be the emulators themselves and how well they work. So essentially, this means it will cap out at basically GameCube and PS2, but at a very high upscale. So you can play all these games at 1080p, and then like I mentioned before, Nintendo Switch is actually very good on here as well. So when it comes down to it, if you're looking for a handheld that is very emulation focused, then I think that the Odin 2 is definitely worth it. It is a high price, but it's one of those endgame handhelds, in the fact that after you buy this one, you're going to be good for a long time coming. Either way, as it stands, what you can play on this device right now is super perfect. So if you are looking for a device device that will basically play all PS2 and GameCube with no issue whatsoever, this is going to be the one handheld for you. Okay, so that's it when it comes to $300 and below. Let's move on to the very high-end systems. These are going to be the ones that I call handheld PCs. Essentially, these are like laptops that have a handheld gaming form factor, and there are many options here. In fact, on this channel, I have reviewed dozens of these at this point. And in 2023, we had a lot of releases. In addition to a bunch of Chinese-based handhelds, we also saw some of the big guns coming out. So Lenovo and Asus also released their own handheld gaming PCs. And of course, all of them are trying to dethrone the Steam Deck, which we'll obviously talk about here later in the video. But before that, let's talk about my favorite Windows-based handheld PC, and that's going to be the Asus ROG Ally. Now, I've made a lot of videos about this handheld. In fact, just last week, I made a 6-month later review talking about why this one was my favorite in the Windows space. And so I'm not going to go over all those details again. Instead, I'll just link that down in the video description below. But suffice to say, when it comes to Windows-based handheld PCs, the ROG Ally really takes the cake for me. A lot of that has to do with the screen, 120Hz refresh rate, 1080p resolution, and it is also variable refresh rate or FreeSync capable. In addition, we've got some excellent controls. I love the analog sticks and the triggers. It makes playing a lot of modern games really fun. And then finally, I also like the ergonomics and weight of this. It's pretty lightweight, and then also it's really fun to hold in the hands. In fact, I can play this for hours on end. Now, the battery life on this is not great, and so often I can't play it for hours on end, but all the same, it's going to cap out at about 2 hours, and you do want to be near an outlet when you're playing this device. Either way, when it comes to Windows-based handheld PCs, I've really been enjoying the ROG Ally. In fact, it has replaced my regular Windows desktop. When I combine it with an external GPU, this is now my primary PC, which is pretty crazy. However, Windows is not the only operating system that works on some of these handhelds, so let's talk about this guy right here. This is the Steam Deck OLED edition. This one is also a very recent release, just came out over the past few weeks, but it is head and shoulders better than any other handheld PC, or handheld for that matter, at least in my opinion. This thing kind of does it all. It has a beautiful screen, incredible controls, and the performance is very excellent too. In addition, with the new OLED update, this one has a better battery life. This one can actually give me about 50% better battery than what I was seeing previously on the other Steam Deck, which honestly still had pretty good battery back then too. Now, the price point between this one and the ROG Ally are pretty similar, about $500 to $600 depending on the model that you get. So it's definitely a big investment. But all the same, one of the things that really drive me towards these two devices is that the companies are taking care of them and making a lot of updates. And that's what I really like about the handheld PC space, is that some of these companies are investing in the device too. And so it's just going to get better over time. And we've seen that happen with both the ROG Ally and definitely the Steam Deck. And so when it comes to deciding between the two, it's a very in-depth conversation. In fact, I did like a 45-minute video about this topic earlier this year. And so I do recommend checking out videos like that or my other ones about the Steam Deck OLED and the ROG Ally if you are interested in picking one of these up. Either way, between these two, I've been kind of torn. On the Windows side, it's a no-brainer. I love the ROG Ally, but I also love the console-like experience of the Steam Deck. And to be honest, if you've been watching this channel for some time, I know that you don't think that those two choices were a surprise at all. And so there we are. Those are my favorite handhelds of 2023. Now, before we close out, I do want to talk a little bit about some devices that I think are going to have a lot of potential in 2024. So we'll start with one that we haven't talked about at all, and that's going to be the Anbernic RG35XX Plus. Now, the original RG35XX came out late last year, and it was very similar to the Miyoo Mini Plus in terms of size and performance. The RG35XX Plus that we're talking about now just came out, and it's got a lot better performance, but the same form factor. This one, in fact, can play a good amount of Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast, so it's really impressive at a small form factor to be able to play those systems. However, one of the things that makes some of these devices very great is custom firmware, when the community gets together and they make really good software options. Unfortunately, this one hasn't been out enough to really see anything materialize. So the way I see it is that a few months from now, later down in 2024, I'm going to make a video where I talk about how this device is now finally worth it, because we got better software, or maybe we've got better performance because of it, things like that. As it stands, in terms of hardware potential, this one has got a lot going for it, and so I think it is a device worth considering in 2024, but right now it's kind of hit or miss. On a similar note, another device that I talked about earlier is the RG Arc. This one doesn't have any custom firmware working for it just yet, but I think that when it does, it's going to be an even better experience. So even though I do think this is a very good handheld in 2023, I think it's going to be even better in 2024. And then finally, even though I've recommended a couple different Retroid devices in this video, I do want to mention that the Retroid Pocket 4 is probably going to be coming out here relatively soon. For example, over Thanksgiving, Retroid put out a teaser graphic where it had "What are you thankful for?" with the number 4. And I thought that was a pretty clever way of saying that they are working on the Retroid Pocket 4. And so I do expect to see that here pretty soon. Now I know nothing about it. I don't know what chipset it's going to be using. I don't know what it's going to look like. But I'm hoping it'll be one of those devices around the $200 price point that'll be a good segue between the $150 devices and the full-scale Odin 2 price point. And so if you're not in a rush to pick up any of these handhelds right here and now, it might be worth waiting just a little bit to see what the Retroid Pocket 4 is going to look like. Anyway, that's really about it for this video here. I appreciate you sticking around through the end. This is a pretty long video, and I had a lot to talk about. As you can imagine, 2023 was amazing for retro handhelds, and I'm really excited to see what comes out in 2024. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Do you agree with my choices as the best handheld of 2023, or am I a big fat liar? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.